I never considered myself difficult. I wasn't loud, I wasn't combative, and I never needed to dominate a room to prove my value. I built my presence through consistency, through clarity, and through the kind of foresight that only shows up in the rearview mirror when everything starts to go wrong. I was in charge of risk management and compliance, not because I sought control, but because I understood consequences. I wasn't in the business of chasing what's next. I was in the business of protecting what we already had. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was critical. I read every contract like a potential headline. I reviewed partnerships like reputational minefields. And over the years, I had quietly saved the company from the kind of slow, systemic breakdowns that no crisis team can fix. No one clapped when a lawsuit never happened, but I knew what it meant to be invisible by design. That changed the day the new COO arrived. He came from a high-growth startup, wore his disruption like a badge of honor, and talked about speed to decision as if it were synonymous with strength. He made it clear from the first meeting. He didn't trust slow, cautious, or methodical. "We're in a new era now," he told the leadership team. "Velocity over legacy. If it feels comfortable, we're doing it wrong." I listened, I observed, and I realized quickly I was no longer the kind of leader this culture valued. At first, it was subtle. My weekly risk summaries, which had once been circulated to the board, stopped getting replies. My recommendations started being called overly protective. When I flagged language in a new vendor agreement, language that would later turn out to be legally unstable, I was told, "Let's not get emotional about hypotheticals." Emotional. That word hit differently. Not careless, not uninformed, emotional. I was being repositioned, not based on the quality of my thinking, but on the perception of my tone. It wasn't long before they pulled me aside. Not in a formal meeting, just a hallway conversation, offhand, with the kind of passive phrasing people use when they've already made a decision. "We're thinking of shifting some of the partnership evaluations to ops directly," he said. "It's not personal, Diana. We just need to move faster. And honestly, some of the feedback has been that your tone can be a little strong." That word again, tone. Not accuracy, not logic, just the volume and conviction behind it. I didn't argue, I didn't plead. I went back to my desk, opened a fresh folder on my desktop, and titled it Ignored Risk Recommendations, Q3. They moved forward with a vendor I had flagged in 3 separate memos. They stripped legal oversight from the onboarding workflow I built 5 years ago. They shortened contract cycles and increased automation, all in the name of speed. And every time I voiced a concern, I was met with the same expression. A tight smile followed by, "We appreciate your input." Then silence. The COO reshuffled my team. Half of my reports were redistributed to junior managers with no compliance background. I was told it was a realignment. I knew better. It was an extraction. They couldn't fire me outright. My record was clean, but they could bury me, so they tried. They didn't take my title. They took my influence. In rooms where I had once been the last voice before a signature, I was now left out of the invite entirely. My name disappeared from pre-launch briefings. I was told that legal would be looped in at the appropriate step, but that step never came. When I tried to raise concerns about the new vendor protocol, how the indemnity clause was missing, how the jurisdiction was weak, how the data protections were written to favor the vendor, not us, it was labeled worst-case scenario thinking. The new tone of the company didn't have time for caution, and certainly not for someone like me who brought systems and standards instead of shortcuts and slogans. But it wasn't just the COO, it was the quiet complicity that followed. People who used to lean on my judgment now copied me only after decisions were finalized. Junior leads stopped asking me to review their draft policies. My once-weekly briefing to the executive committee was canceled to make space for more immediate revenue initiatives. My access to cross-functional documents narrowed. I wasn't removed, I was diluted. Spread thinner, included later, made to feel like a legacy relic in a company trying to outrun its own shadow. Still, I didn't escalate. I didn't correct anyone in meetings. I didn't try to claw my way back. I kept writing, quietly, thoroughly. Every time I was excluded from a decision involving risk, I documented it. Every time someone approved a policy I had warned against, I filed a dated summary of what I would have advised. My desktop filled with folders titled by risk category, vendor name, exposure type. I saved every message, every silence, every version of my compliance framework that had been stripped for brevity. I wasn't bitter, I was methodical, because I had seen what happened to organizations that ran on confidence instead of process. And this company, once measured and disciplined, had become allergic to friction. The same leadership that praised alignment couldn't see that they were blurring into groupthink. And when people operate in echo chambers, risk isn't debated, it's dismissed until it explodes. But I didn't plan to catch them in a mistake. I didn't build a case to someday wave in someone's face. That's not how this story goes. What I did every night after being excluded, overlooked, or bypassed was maintain the one thing they had forgotten how to value: record, not memory, proof. A map of what had been warned, what had been ignored, and what was quietly building behind their sprint toward scale. They called me too emotional. But emotion didn't write those policies. Emotion didn't scan those contracts. And emotion wasn't what would save them later. I knew that. I just needed to wait for the day they would finally learn it too. Once they had finished stripping my influence, they assumed I would either shrink or leave. But I did neither. I stayed exactly where they left me, uninvited, unacknowledged, unconsulted, and used the quiet they gave me as space to build something stronger than reaction: record. The compliance framework they had rejected, I didn't discard. I refined it, section by section, clause by clause. I updated contingency models for every vendor they onboarded without review. I rewrote breach response protocols to reflect the exact legal gaps they had opened by prioritizing speed over liability. I watched them chase rapid scale, and I documented the vulnerabilities they created with every shortcut. No one asked me to do this. They thought I'd been neutralized, but they had misunderstood my silence. They thought it meant retreat. What it actually meant was that I had stopped trying to persuade them and started preparing for consequence. I saved every email, every signed agreement that bypassed review, every red flag that had once lived in my original version of the risk register. I created side-by-side comparisons between what I had proposed and what had been approved without oversight. In most companies, that would be overkill. In this one, it was foresight, and I wasn't alone in seeing the shift. Quietly, mid-level managers began asking if I still had access to older templates. One risk analyst sent me a Slack message late one evening. Out of curiosity, did you ever build that escalation matrix we discussed last year? I feel like we need it now. Another asked if I remembered which data vendor had the cleanest indemnity clause. I did. Of course I did. They had ignored me, but the structure I'd built remained. Shadow systems, invisible until suddenly necessary. The real strategy wasn't resistance. It was continuity. I knew the company would hit a wall. It was only a matter of time. They were running too fast through too many legal gray zones. And when systems like that crash, they don't need heroes. They need blueprints. Quiet ones. The kind that were already sitting on my drive, timestamped, reviewed, buried under a dozen decisions made in the name of progress. They thought they'd sidelined me, but what they didn't realize was that I had simply changed rooms. I was no longer sitting at the table. I was building what the table would collapse onto when it finally broke. In the months that followed, I did what I had always done, only quieter. The difference was, now no one was watching. There were no more review meetings, no strategy briefings, no pushback to navigate. So I worked without friction. No one edited my drafts, no one redlined my clauses. No one asked me to shorten it for clarity or tone it down for tone. And because no one expected me to be part of the process, I was free to build what the process actually needed. I completed the full version of the vendor oversight framework they had shelved. I added breach response protocols for the platforms they were onboarding without compliance review. I simulated reputational fallout scenarios, not to scare anyone, but to understand how the system would bend under stress. I kept these documents versioned and dated, not out of spite, out of discipline. Meanwhile, I watched the decisions roll out. Vendor deals with no sunset clauses. Third-party contractors onboarded without region-specific compliance audits. Marketing campaigns launched using data sources I hadn't vetted. One agreement even lacked a non-disclosure clause. I flagged it in a comment. The reply I received was 3 words. Legal approved this. They hadn't. They weren't even copied on the thread. But that wasn't my battle. Not anymore. I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I wasn't laying a trap. I was simply tracking the difference between what I had built and what they had accepted instead. Each time a shortcut was taken, I saved the version before it. Each time a clause was removed, I saved the rationale that justified its absence. I did this because one day, someone would ask, "Did anyone see this coming?" And I needed to be able to say, "Yes, I did. Here's the date, here's the file, here's the line." And in that silence, something else began to shift. People started hesitating, not publicly, but behind closed doors. A manager asked me, privately, if a new vendor contract could be just glanced at for optics. A team lead dropped by my office and said, "Off the record, would this put us at risk?" These weren't official requests. These were quiet recognitions that something had been lost in the transition, that maybe we hadn't eliminated the friction, we'd eliminated the foresight. I answered their questions plainly, without bitterness, without agenda, because I had no desire to be proven right in disaster. I wanted prevention, not vindication, but I also knew that once a system removes checks, its mistakes grow silently. Until they don't, until they land in inboxes, or courtrooms, or headlines. And when that moment came, I wouldn't need to say anything at all. The file path would say it for me. It started with a message, simple, vague, but unmistakably urgent. Legal flagged a concern. A newly onboarded vendor had breached protocol by subcontracting without disclosure. At first, leadership framed it as a misunderstanding, just a gap in communication. But those of us who had been paying attention knew what it really was. A clause that never existed, in a contract that had never been reviewed by the right people. The vendor had done what the document allowed them to do, which was far more than it should have. I stayed quiet. I waited. The COO held a meeting the next day. He looked tired, edges dulled, words slower. He spoke about tightening oversight, about reaffirming our trust in third-party partnerships. Not once did he mention the phrase legal exposure, but legal exposure was exactly what was growing behind the scenes. The breach had triggered a chain reaction. Sensitive data, though technically anonymized, had been handled by a firm based in a region with different data protection laws. One of our international clients noticed and sent a formal letter of concern. Not a lawsuit? Yet. But a clear legal breadcrumb. And with it came a request for documentation. Please provide your internal compliance framework for third-party vendor risk. That request made it all real. Not speculative, not potential, present, tangible. And the scramble began. Legal needed paperwork. The ops team needed to reconstruct timelines. And leadership suddenly needed to know what policies were in place, when, and by whom. I wasn't included in the early response group, but my name came up, quickly, because the documentation they needed hadn't been built by the team currently in charge. It had been buried months ago when the framework was rejected. That afternoon, I received an email from someone in the general counsel's office. No subject line, no greeting, just, Diana, do you still have your original Q3 compliance model? I did. Of course I did. With timestamps, with clauses, with breach scenarios mapped and responses detailed. The document was 28 pages long. I replied with a link and nothing more. No commentary. No, I told you so. Just the work. The work they had dismissed as too emotional. The work that now stood between a company-wide reputational spiral and a manageable containment strategy. And suddenly, the door that had been closed without explanation was open again. Not because they wanted me back, because they needed what I had never stopped protecting, even when they tried to erase it. By the end of that week, the tone had changed. The COO, once full of certainty and volume, had begun speaking in softer terms. Review, reflection, process recalibration. The legal team, now at the center of everything, worked quietly but intensely. Every email had weight, every meeting had subtext, but what none of them could say aloud was already obvious. The situation had been avoidable, and the only thing standing between us and legal escalation was the very framework they had discarded without a second glance. I wasn't brought into meetings right away. They used my documents, my language, even my timeline, but kept me at a distance, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps out of habit. I didn't protest. I didn't need to be in the room to see that the culture was shifting. Where they once dismissed caution, they now sought it. Where they once asked for summaries, they now requested details. Questions became more specific, follow-ups more frequent. Even the tone of leadership emails changed, less definitive, more conditional. I recognized the posture. It was the beginning of humility, the kind that doesn't come from character but from consequence. Then came the escalation. The client who had initially sent a letter of concern followed up with a formal legal inquiry. A lawsuit wasn't filed, but the risk became real enough to involve outside counsel. The breach hadn't just exposed data, it had revealed systemic negligence. The COO convened a closed-door session with legal, PR, and operations. I was finally added to the invite list. No subject line, no note, just a calendar block with the words, Vendor Response Strategy. I walked into that room and no one spoke over me. No one smirked when I laid out a plan. No one cut me off when I said the word liability. They listened. Because now the work was undeniable. Not theoretical, not emotional, necessary. I didn't reference the past. I didn't remind anyone how we got here. I focused on what had to be done to contain the fallout. Exactly as I had detailed in the appendix of the framework they had once dismissed for being too long. Every protocol I had quietly written was now activated step by step. I saw printouts of my redlined contract language spread across the table. I saw clauses I had fought to include now cited as the reason we still had leverage. And I saw eyes, the same ones that used to look past me, now watching carefully, waiting for direction. This wasn't a victory, it was a rescue, a salvage operation made possible not by loud leadership, but by quiet preparation. And for the first time in months, the room was structured around something real. Not spin, not optimism, not the illusion of momentum, but foresight and the systems that only exist because someone refused to stop building them, even after she was told to sit down and be quiet. The internal fallout didn't happen with shouting or scandal. It happened the way fragile systems always fail, quietly, then completely. In the days following the legal escalation, a kind of collective stillness settled over leadership. There were no more strategy town halls, no more bullet point updates filled with forward-facing optimism. Just a recognition, unspoken but deeply felt, that the company had crossed a line. Not because something went wrong, but because someone had been right long before it did, and they hadn't listened. The COO stopped sending late-night Slack messages. The all-caps directives vanished from inboxes. He became a shadow of the persona he had once projected. No longer the energetic disruptor, just a man trying to outlast a consequence. He called for process reviews he no longer understood, quietly delegated comms to legal, and began deferring publicly to the same risk team he had once labeled slow. His posture changed before his position did. The board got involved, first quietly, then decisively. They began asking questions that couldn't be answered in 2 slides. When was this flagged? Who approved this clause? Was risk consulted? The silence in response was damning. One director reportedly asked during a closed review, "Why was this plan not implemented when it existed?" No one in the room had a clean answer, but they all knew the subtext, and so did I. Meanwhile, my team, what was left of it, began rebuilding what had been dismantled. We reissued the compliance protocols I had completed months ago, now branded urgent updates. Training modules I had written during my sidelined months were dusted off and suddenly central to the remediation effort. No one changed my language. They didn't even rename the files. The COO signed off on documents he'd once dismissed with a smirk. His initials appeared beneath my recommendations now, quietly, as if trying to rewrite history through silence. But reputational damage doesn't vanish with internal apologies. Our partners noticed. One pulled out of a pending agreement. Another requested third-party audits before continuing the relationship. The company had lost more than operational stability, it had lost trust. And rebuilding that takes more than leadership statements. It takes someone willing to hold the memory of what was ignored. In a final attempt to maintain authority, the COO issued a memo, high-level, vague, filled with words like learning opportunity and strategic reset. But it landed flat. The staff had seen too much, and the board had seen enough. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a chair left empty at the end of the quarter, and everyone knows whose name used to be on it. By the start of the next quarter, the COO was gone. No announcement, no farewell message, not even a closed-door send-off, just a short line in the internal bulletin. Name will be pursuing new opportunities outside the company. The kind of sentence that sounds like a choice, but feels like consequence. His office door, once always open for performative transparency, remained shut for days before it was reassigned. And in his absence, no one rushed to fill the vacuum. Because by then, the real work had shifted away from the personality that once commanded the room, back toward the people who had kept the structure alive when no one was watching. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer commentary. I kept showing up. Same time, same posture, same standard. But now the weight of the room had changed. My presence wasn't tolerated. It was depended on. Meetings began to shift. No more quick wins with missing clauses, no more urgency theater dressed up as strategy. We spoke slower, we documented better, we asked harder questions. And when I gave risk assessments now, no one called them emotional. They called them essential. The compliance framework I had quietly finished was now official policy. Legal called it best practice. The board called it long overdue. And the staff? They started to see something they hadn't known to look for before. What leadership looks like when it's done in silence. I led the rebuild, not in title, not yet, but in function. My name began to appear at the top of drafts again. I was the one being asked to brief the board, not to explain what had gone wrong, but to outline how it would never happen again. My language, once edited for being too cautious, was now quoted in executive updates verbatim. What had once been erased had become doctrine, and more than anything, the culture changed. The newer employees, the ones who'd never known the before, now looked to me with questions instead of waiting for directives from the loudest person in the room. They understood something the previous leadership never had. You don't need a stage to lead. You need standards. I mentored the analysts who'd been silenced, encouraged them to document even when it felt futile, reminded them that prevention often looks invisible, until it's the only thing standing between a company and collapse. In the end, I didn't get justice in the form of revenge. I got justice in the form of recognition, of having the structures I protected finally recognized for what they were: survival. They had called me too emotional to lead, but it wasn't emotion that saved them. It was clarity, held steady through their noise until the noise broke itself. When they offered me the promotion, I didn't celebrate. I accepted it the way I had handled everything else: quietly, deliberately, and without the need to rewrite what had already happened. My new title was Chief Ethics and Risk Officer, reporting directly to the board. But it wasn't the title that mattered. It was what came with it: autonomy, structure, and the authority to ensure that no voice built on vigilance would ever be sidelined again. The first thing I did was restore the team, not just in number, but in depth. I brought back the analysts who had been fractured across departments, given vague project scopes and meaningless titles to keep them quiet. I met with each of them, one by one, not to hand out blame, but to ask what they would have built if they hadn't been edited. Their answers weren't angry, they were sharp, focused, full of the kind of long-view thinking that had once defined this company before speed replaced safety. Together, we rebuilt the compliance infrastructure, not as a barrier to growth, but as a foundation beneath it. I created a dedicated division that reviewed every vendor, every clause, every workflow touching risk, before the decision, not after the fallout. We designed systems that didn't rely on intuition or charisma, but on method and foresight. We called it Quiet Foresight. Internally, people laughed at the name, but it stuck because it wasn't just a system. It was a memory of what happens when the only person looking ahead is the one everyone calls emotional. I changed how we trained leadership. No more how to command a room workshops. We trained on how to listen to dissent, how to distinguish discomfort from danger, how to pause when someone raises a flag, not because you're weak, but because you're responsible. We taught that silence from compliance isn't consent, it's often exclusion. I didn't erase what happened, I integrated it. The breach, the scramble, the collapse. It was written into case studies, used in onboarding materials, not to shame, but to teach, because legacies don't begin with titles. They begin the moment someone keeps doing the work, even when the room stops listening. I had done that, and now I was building a system where no one would ever have to do it alone again. I never returned to the version of leadership they once told me I wasn't built for. I didn't become louder. I didn't harden my edges to appear less emotional. I stayed exactly as I was, measured, intuitive, precise, and that was enough, more than enough, because what saved the company wasn't a louder voice. It was a quiet one that kept speaking, even after no one listened. My legacy wasn't forged in the meetings I was excluded from. It was shaped in every moment I chose to keep writing, keep tracking, keep preparing, long after they'd decided I didn't belong at the table. And now the table looks different. Risk isn't a side note, it's a starting point. Insight isn't shortened for efficiency, it's contextualized for clarity. And leadership isn't defined by certainty, it's defined by responsibility. I began mentoring women across departments, those who'd been told they were too much, too careful, and too emotional. I showed them that emotion and precision are not opposites, that there is power in caution and wisdom in pause. We didn't build power by being louder, we built it by being right, consistently, quietly, until the results could no longer be denied. I watched junior analysts evolve into trusted advisors. I saw men who once dismissed gut instinct now ask for risk briefings before key decisions. And I heard my language repeated in boardrooms, not as slogans, but as standards. The very phrasing they once edited from my reports now shaped policy, not because I insisted, but because it worked. I never asked to be thanked, but one day, after a long executive review session, one of the board members, someone who had once co-signed my removal from high-level meetings, stayed behind. He said, "We didn't see it then, we do now. Thank you for not stopping." I nodded. I didn't need more. I already had what mattered. A system that now holds space for people like me. A company no longer protected by noise, but by structure. They had called me too emotional to lead, but emotion didn't cloud my judgment. It sharpened it. It kept me human in the face of institutional amnesia. And in the end, it wasn't emotion that nearly destroyed them, it was arrogance. And it wasn't authority that saved them, it was a woman they tried to silence, who kept working anyway.